All right, guys.
I'm going to go ahead and follow instructions. How you guys doing tonight?
Hi.
You're doing good, right? Yeah. I know last time we
Cheaters.
came up here we talked about stress. I hope you guys had a pretty good weekend and de-stressed from all those activities. Tonight, Kalyn and Jacob and I are going to be talking to you guys about impressions and attitudes, how people develop them. I'm going to be talking about how impressions develop people, and Miss Kalyn will be talking about how we develop our attitudes, and wonderful Mr. Jacob's going to be talking about the Christian aspect of this. So I do want to appreciate Julie for kicking it off tonight for us, talking about those first impressions, kind of start us on the right foot. So, but pretty much people base their attitudes from a person, place, thing, or situation from the impression that it has in their lives. Okay, so impression is not just something just. If you just see somebody, if you just meet somebody, just walking along, that's not really impression. It's just somebody that you saw or whatnot. Impression is when somebody truly makes a statement that you're going to remember. And because we have free will to remember these things and to make our own opinions and our own judgments about these different situations and the impressions that come into our lives, free will is something that does take a very big part of it. However, the cost of it could be high because you could make the wrong impression and then you just got yourself a world of hurt in some situations. So I want to go ahead and basically kind of go into what an impression is to me, okay? Because like I was starting to mention before, it's not just walking by and saying hi. It's something that you leave with the person, something that they're going to remember about you, For example, Lance, we all remember he has an impression on us. He likes to have fun and bubbly and like do stuff like that. So that's an impression that's been made upon us. An impression is a characteristic, a trait feature resulting from influence or telling an image impressed on someone's senses or mind. The act of impressing could be communicating of a mold, a trait, or a character by an external force or influence. So I'm going to go ahead and give a little example of an impression on how you can make an impression on something. Yes.
All right.
I want purple.
Now, if you open it up, the first thing that you will notice, the first impression of the Play-Doh, is perfectly round. It's untouched. It's one color, and it's not dried out.
It's child-proof.
Yeah.
And that's the first impression that you get. But the second thing is when you go ahead and you stick your thumb in there, or you stick a quarter or a coin or something on that, it makes an impression. And I know that I passed these out early, but I'm going to go ahead and ask us to do a scientific study so that we don't get distracted and ignore the rest of my team. So why don't you go ahead and make an impression in your Play-Doh and then put it back and close it up.
Gotta open it first.
And then what we're going to do is we're going to see at the end of our little example here if it still has the same impression. Okay? And how much that is basically firm and set in you. So basically, witness or a sight versus an impression. So like, for example, what Jane wore the other day, I'm not going to remember that 2 months from now. Okay? But something that had been impressed on me is, for example, Grand Canyon. We lived right near California, or in California, near the Grand Canyon. And we never wanted, my mom always wanted to see it. We don't want to see the Grand Canyon. It's a hole in the earth. We don't want to see it. So it didn't really make an impression on us. But one year, my husband and I were driving out to California. We actually stopped and saw it. As much as I was less than enthused about seeing it, but he went ahead and got us a helicopter ride through the Grand Canyon.
Oh.
I will tell you what, that hole in the dirt made a big impression on me. Because I saw from a different viewpoint. And I was able, and it just impressed something, and now it's something that I'm never going to forget. I love eating cookies. Who doesn't like eating cookies?
I like eating cookies.
There you go. Does not like eating cookies. Everyone likes eating cookies. Love eating cookies. But you know what? It made an impression on me when I was younger, and my grandma, she made holiday cookies. And I like to eat them, that's fine, but the one thing that I have is that impression on me is from my grandmother in the kitchen making holiday cookies. That's an impression. And when people meet, the importance of impressions are also when people meet, what they do is we explore each other to identify the other individual's attitude towards certain things, to see what is going to be, what we're going to have in common, what we're going to differ from, what we have intellectually, and what we have socially, what we like to do for fun, and see if we're going to be friends and hang out outside of school, or if we're just going to be, hi, see you at school next week type of people. And so that's something that's a reason why impressions are important to us, because it also helps us to make judgments about our own personal lives. Because if you meet somebody, and if your impression of them is a little, you have kids, right? So if you meet somebody or some people have kids, some don't, I apologize. But if you meet somebody who your impression on them is not the most desirable in the world, you're going to keep a hawk eye out for those kids. But if your impression is good, well, the judgment that you have on that individual is going to be, okay, you can go play, you can go to the park, or you can do whatnot. You're going to be watching them. But your impression was a little bit easier. Your judgment on that was a little bit easier. And this is where Kalyn's going to come and talk about the judgment on your impressions.
So as Laurie was saying in the group before about first impressions and how first impressions can be taken by just your physical appearance or your social interaction, how people perceive things, I want to hand out our first little sheet. So the first paper is going to show you an example of a first impression. So this is an example of what society perceives as, someone that could be a doctor, but if you were to see him outside of the workforce, he could look totally different. So my thing is, do you think that first impressions affect the attitudes of oneself? So people's attitude towards people with tattoos could be a big example. If they were to see a doctor like that, they would have a different impression of him. Oh, he's a biker. And it goes into cliches, and they start stereotyping people based on their appearance instead of based on their actual job description and what they do for a living and what they actually contribute to society. So it can affect our attitudes, because then you start to think of bikers and tattoos and they're all mean people, and they're not. It's just societies or what your impressions are built on throughout your life.
Like racism.
Exactly, racism and stereotyping, that kind of thing. So what is an attitude and what causes them? Psychologists define attitude as a learned tendency to evaluate things in a certain way, including the evaluations of people, issues, objects, or events. Whereas our textbook defines it as enduring behavioral or cognitive tendencies that are expressed by evaluating particular people, places, or things with favor or disfavor. So as you look at this example of an impression, what would your attitude be contributed from that impression? Yes. What would your attitude be from that impression of that doctor?
Cool doctor.
If you didn't see him without his lab coat, like which impression would you rather have?
I'd rather have one on the left.
And then what would your impression want to be? Like what would you feel more comfortable seeing him as?
Depends on where I was at.
Like obviously in the doctor's office you'd rather see him in his lab coat, whereas in an outside event you'd probably rather see him in his normal clothes and being himself.
I would start stereotyping and be like, I don't know if I want him to, be working on me or whatever, looking at me, this guy's messed up.
And that goes by our impressions and attitudes that we form throughout our life against those kind of stereotypes. So attitude formation is developed through conditioning and observational learning. So conditioning is our cultural influence to think about others' ethnicities, religions, social classes, countries, and etc. So that would be an example too, like our culture is not very, it's starting to get more into, tattoos and stuff like that. But before it was very, anti, that's bad, you're evil, stuff like that. And not that you are, I have them too, so. But I do get looked down on because at work I have to cover them all up. And so I get a different perspective to where if I go back into work out of my work attire, sometimes I get people that look at me differently. Oh, she has tattoos on her. But, or if I go to church without my tattoos covered, people look at me differently, but those are also, it depends on how they were raised. If they were raised more traditional in their, morals, or if they were kind of raised more of that, we love everybody, we don't judge people. So, for an example of conditioning, I would like to talk about, the French and how they hate Americans, and it could be just a perception. Not all French hate Americans, but a majority of them do, and so they are conditioned to think negative things. So negative influences on us can condition us to think a certain way. So, for instance, like, arrogance, power hungry, we look like a macho country, and, some of us can agree or disagree. But, however, a Frenchman conditioned to love the U.S. and to be taught positive ideals about us would be opposed to the thoughts of their fellow American Frenchmen. So, having those kind of conditionings will affect the person's thought on how they have attitudes towards issues, ideals, and people. So positive and negative things are done or said or conditioned to our formation of attitudes. Also important to the formation of impressions is the cognitive appraisal. People are more motivated to understand the environment so that they can make predictions and exercise some control over it. So I was raised with a lot of people that were, like, my family was a lot of alcoholics, druggies, they got tattoos, like they were really rebellious. And then I also had my super, super Christian family that was the opposite of that, where they kind of clashed. So I kind of grew up both sides of it, to where I have a medium, to where I love both of them. I don't really like the hypocritical side, but my attitude towards them is I love them. So it's our certain things that we go through, our impressions, and the first impressions is what causes us to form those attitudes throughout our life and experiences. So, for example, of another conditioning, what happens with attitudes is we can get changed through new information and change our ideals about how we see things. So, for instance, like back in the 40s and 50s, when our great-grandparents and grandmothers were, drinking and smoking and putting our babies in little lead cribs, back then it wasn't a big deal. Well, after studies and research, they found out that, smoking and drinking led to low birth weight, birth defects, and then lead-based paint caused, it caused it caused, SIDS, higher rate of SIDS. It caused immune disorders because of the lead in their body. It caused poisonings for little babies, and to that it became, catastrophic. So after that, it brought our awareness, it changed our attitudes to how if you see a pregnant woman walking down the street, you're probably, if she's smoking, you're probably going to think very negatively of her and have a different attitude of her. Where if you see, a pregnant woman walking down the street, eating an apple or something and being healthy, you're going to have a different attitude towards her. So that kind of conditioning helps our forming of attitudes. So changing attitudes through persuasion. So 2 routes to persuasion would be the central route, which inspires thoughtful consideration of both sides of arguments and evidence. As Oscar Wilde put, he said, arguments are to be avoided. They're always vulgar and often convincing. So there's always 2 sides to arguments. There's the negative aspect and then the convincing aspect, to where it makes you think things and reevaluate things. So knowing how to have a good perspective of both sides of the argument and having evidence to back it up will also contribute to the formation of attitudes. So a great example on how arguments can cause a persuasion of doubt or change one's views on things would be, that would be an example. Would be the arguments are to be avoided because they're always vulgar and often convincing. And then the second would be the peripheral route, which is ways in which we associate objects with positive or negative cues. So positive cues would be a smile or a hug, that positive body language. Negative cues would be unfriendly tone of voice, standing at an uncomfortable distance, and etc., stuff like that. So just that kind of formation of attitudes, the part of that first impressions to form that attitude of, if someone's coming at you and attacking you that you've never met before, you would be like, I don't like that person at all, because they don't even know me and they're coming and attacking me and judging me. Where if you're meeting someone for the first time and they give you a big old hug, specifically like in a church, and they welcome you and it's not fake, you're going to have a great, positive cue from them. So all these help us to form our own attitudes and impression in social interaction. So much is still to be learned from the way we develop such patterns and responses. help us in our society social development to better understand how we function and how we function along with others. And then, as the Bible says in Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So how does God feel about our attitudes and impressions? I would look at John 8:15. You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one. So yes, our physical appearances is a way to form an impression or form our ways of attitudes. But the Bible says in 2 Corinthians 10:7, you are judging by appearances. If anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, they should consider him again. We belong to Christ just as much as they do. We may have human, social, psychological standards to determine our attitudes and impressions, but this is what God says in Isaiah 11:3. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears. Nothing explains our interpretation or impressions and attitudes better than God, the one who made us. The God who knows we are not the judge of this world to please man, but to please God and his glory. So I'd like to turn it over to Jacob, where he's going to tell us about the church's theories and their findings in the area of impressions and attitudes.
So, just real briefly, Laurie, she was kind of talking about impressions and how impressions, affect attitudes. And then on the flip side, though, we have Kalyn. She's kind of talking about how really your attitude can affect, or my attitude can affect your impression towards me, right? So, real briefly, what I would like you to do is give these ladies a hand. They did a lot of research and So, my name is Jacob Wing, and for some reason I always have to do the church aspect. I think like I'm a preacher or something or whatnot in this group. I have no idea what that means. But really, I'm getting my degree in business, and I really have a lot of, I like business. I have a little bit of business and Christian, as from a pastoral perspective, type of background. So enough about me. How many of you guys like Coke?
I like Coke.
Well, yeah.
Coke versus Pepsi. Who likes Coke?
I like
Coke.
Right. We got Coke though right there. Right. So
Habit machine. Coke.
how many like Quick Trip?
I like Quick Trip.
Yeah.
I like
Quick Trip,
I
come
like
and
Quick
go.
Trip.
Quick Trip is Tulsa's own, right? I bring that out because if you look at Coke, and we used to talk about, in reference, I'm not really kind of going a different route in reference to the church aspect. And what I would kind of like to talk about real briefly is branding, okay? So when we talk about Coke outside of like maybe a health perspective, Coke has a good image. Would you agree with that?
Pays my mortgage.
Right?
Open happiness.
It's refreshing when it's cold. It's delicious to drink. It's satisfying, right? It's something different than water. So when you leave here today, go and grab you a Coke. But here's the other thing is that Coke, if you went to France or if you went to England or if you went to Germany and you said the word Coke, even in other areas of the world, they would pretty much know exactly what you're talking about. Because Coke has branded itself, not just nationally, but worldwide, and it has a great image. Now, on the flip side, Quick Trip is the same way, but more locally. As a matter of fact, Quick Trip was rated one of the top Fortune 500 best places to work in the United States. Why? Because not only is it a great place to work, but it has a great brand. And people like going to Quick Trip. You can get Cokes for cheap, you can get drinks for cheap, and they always greet you with a smile. When you walk in the door, the first thing, hey, how are you? When you leave, hey, come back, right? Every time, because they have developed a brand around what they want their customers to think about. So, for example, I was going to kind of use this. How many of y'all have ever seen that movie? I Know What You Did Last Summer?
Yeah.
Movie, right?
I was there.
So just imagine this. I walk into Quick Trip. I walked in today. I go up to the counter. I put my Coke on the counter, and they look at me and they have like this weird look. And they go, I know what you did last summer. That would freak me out. I would just right? But what if they went into some detail and said, you killed a guy, you and your friends, you killed a guy last summer. I'd be like, well, how did you know? And you disposed of his body. Well, we didn't know. We didn't know he was dead. You know, whatever, right? I would just come up with a whole bunch of excuses that would make me feel very uncomfortable, and I really would want to leave. Okay? I mean, would you agree with that? Wouldn't you agree with that? You'd want to leave too. As a matter of fact, I may have an accident on myself if you started that. But on the flip side, I could walk in the Quick Trip, have a Coke, and he could say, well, you know that's bad for you. And then, you know, every morning, sometimes I go and get a donut, you know, from Quick Trip. Well, you know, donuts, that's unhealthy. I mean, if they started saying that type of stuff, we would have a different perspective or impression of what Quick Trip really was. And Quick Trip's brand would basically go down the drain. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So, with that example, the purpose of that example, I would like to kind of get in a little bit of church and branding. Time magazine article, Christianity's Image, which was wrote by David Van Beema. He writes about how Barna polls were conducted between the years of 2004 and 2007. And what they did was, the poll found that 38%, or let me back up a little. They polled 440 non-Christians between the age of 16 to 29. Okay? And what they found was that 38% had a bad impression of present-day Christianity and churchgoers. So at a young age, from 16 to 29, 38%, that's significantly high for that type of brand. Why is it? If 38% of the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma had a bad image on Quick Trip, their profits will go down tremendously. However, with this type of image, the church is losing a big percentage of young, especially in the Western world, Christians. They're losing them. Well, why is this? So the main reason that they stated in the article was that they contributed the attitudes of Christians as being judgmental and being hypocritical. Now, attitudes affect the impressions of others. So if you walk in to a bank or to Quick Trip and they start asking you, I know what you did last summer, that automatically affects your impression, right?
Yeah.
So Kalyn mentioned this earlier, John 8:15. It says, you judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one. So who's that speaking? Christ, obviously, right? So you judge by human standards, but I don't pass judgment on anyone. Why is that? Well, obviously, there's a bunch of sinners in the world, even Christians, that are sinners, right? And Christ understood that. So Christ understands us more than what we actually understand or even interpret or have, ourselves. I mean, we don't have that same